We are delighted to have with us Dexter Roberts, the author of The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you.
The gleaming towers and the high-speed trains and expressways of urban China are well known, but there is also another China that generally includes almost half of China, is the China that we know little about. In the last 3 decades, we all know China has made enormous progress and has migrated many of its people from the farming to the manufacturing, and in the process has created also a dramatic improvement in its urban areas as well. Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen are the few names that we know of, but there are many more out there. But there is a rural China. There is also inner China that we know very little about. But this is the book that focuses on that part of it as well. So we will talk about many of those issues that focuses on the urban and rural divide in China, why the Chinese capitalism is a myth, what Chinese policymakers are doing, and how people of China are coping with it and adjusting with it, and who is taking the burden of the rising inequality, why there is inequality, and how Chinese people are dealing with it. So to discuss and listen and learn all about these things, we have with us Dexter Roberts, who has been a long-time resident of Beijing, about 23 years, and also a foreign correspondent with the magazine Business Week. And currently Dexter is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative and a fellow at the University of Montana's Mansfield Center. So welcome to Redera again. And tell us why the title of the book, Myth of Chinese Capitalism.
So there's several myths in the title of my book, and the probably the biggest myth that I deal with is that China is becoming more capitalistic today. And by capitalistic, what do I mean? I mean it's really shorthand for continuing to open its economy and continue with these reforms that were very real and very important to the growth we've seen in China and the lifting of people's living standards over the last 4 decades or so. And this was after former leader Deng Xiaoping launched, they call it in Chinese, 改革开放, reform and opening in China. So these reforms, again, very real, very, very important for the success story that we see, particularly in urban China today. But the myth that still not everyone has really woken up to is that these reforms will continue on and on despite some ups and downs over the years, and China will continue to open up. And I think what we've seen, particularly over the last 5+ years, is that China is no longer on this path towards continued reform. And so this is one of the big myths. The other associated myth, which has been very, very important for lots of people, but certainly very important for big multinationals around the world, is this assumption that China's middle class, which is already very, very large, maybe 100 or 200 million, depending on who you talk to, that it will continue to keep getting larger and larger as it has in previous years. And I argue in my book that is a myth, and that continued growth in the middle class that multinationals have been very reliant on and has helped them drive their global revenues in many cases and profits cannot continue unless China begins to reform several very important policies that I really dig into in my book.
Fascinating. And of course, we'll take different myths again a little bit later in the book. Just to give a little bit more context to the listeners who have not followed China very well beyond the headlines, who are the migrant workers and what led to China becoming the factory to the world, and how China managed to accomplish it? What drove the rise of the manufacturing success in China, first in southern China, and then it spread from there? How did that all happen in the 70s and early 80s? How did all this start, and what made that happen?
So a crucial moment, one I already referenced, was the decision by former leader Deng Xiaoping to launch this reform and opening in the very late 70s, early 80s. And that reform involved a few things. One was starting with always with joint ventures in the beginning, and then later wholly foreign-owned operations allowed international investors and companies to come into China and set up their own factories there, usually for exporting to the world. So that was one crucial part of it. He also launched what they called special economic zones, the most famous being the one in Shenzhen, which allowed certain areas, in this case, the one here, Shenzhen, to have different tariff policies and freer policies on foreign investment in order to encourage the creation of these new factories. So that was one key part of it. Another key part of it was really beginning to allow the Great Migration. And this was the decision, despite a policy called the Household Registration Policy, or the hukou policy, which had previously, along with the communes, made it very difficult for rural people to come into the cities in most cases. This was liberalized. At least the ability of these rural people in the Chinese countryside to travel to the cities and work there became much easier. And they became the source of cheap labor, which really was crucial to the growth of this export-oriented economy in China. So first step was Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening in the late 70s. Another crucial point for China was when it entered the World Trade Organization in late 2001. Previously, it had started negotiations for the 2 years preceding that. And this, again, opened up all sorts of industries that lowered tariffs, took protections off many Chinese industries that had been protected before, and really set off an even larger flow of foreign investment into China. And so that those two moments really were what drove this factory to the world model, which until not too many years ago was still a real growth engine for the Chinese economy. And as I mentioned earlier, very much a growth engine for multinationals around the world as well.
So the underpinning of the China's reform at the beginning was that Chinese leaders realized that there are lots and lots of people and their labor rates are very low and cheap, and the large corporations around the world were looking for a source of cheap labor, and they all came together through the special economic zone in southern China, and the whole thing started. And that worked very well for China for many decades, that many people were able to find jobs, and China was able to attract capital and businesses and expand its capacity to produce more and more complicated stuff as it moved on the curve of manufacturing. And then the hukou system started intervening, but the hukou system was always there. Those who do not know, tell us what this system is and how it creates a second-class citizen.
So the hukou system goes way back in China's history. Some people point back to centuries ago and a tradition of having some kind of household registration for the Chinese population. And I think that did exist in one form or another. But its modern origin really dates back to the 50s. And at that time, the previous leader, Mao Zedong, the revolutionary leader, was taking many cues from Stalin, actually, in the then Soviet Union. And he, when the hukou was really, the modern version of the hukou was really created in the 50s, he really borrowed from a Soviet system. I believe it was called Propiska, which was an internal passport system within the then Soviet Union. And he instituted this in China. And at that point, again, borrowing a leaf from the Soviet Union and Stalin, he was very focused on doing rapid industrialization in China, with some very unfortunate episodes that followed that, like the Great Leap Forward and all sorts of some very bad things like mass starvation. But the motivation was to have a fairly docile rural population that would stay in the countryside, were then in communes, and would produce relatively cheap food for an urban class that was more focused on industrialization. So it was it's actually a great irony of the communist revolution in China that a revolution that was supposed to be for the masses from the very early years had this system put in place, which in effect divided the population between rural and urban into two classes.
And these migrant workers, they left farming and joined the manufacturing revolution in the hope of better life or higher pay. But They remain migrant even after 30 years. They have difficulty in accessing housing. Their children have difficulty accessing education. And in many respects, they have many issues with the public officials. So they are the ones who are bearing a brunt of a lot of difficulties in the factory conditions and also in the public officials' wrath. Tell us, what are the conditions like, or what were the conditions like in the early 80s and 90s when these migrant workers were working in the factories? How difficult or how challenging it was, and what were the sacrifices they made that led to the rise of China as the factory to the world?
Well, the change that was important was to begin to allow these rural people, particularly with the dismantling of the communes and then the reforms of Deng Xiaoping and later entry into the World Trade Organization, allow them to go and leave the countryside and work in the cities, working mainly then in factories and on construction sites. But what was not changed was the fact that their social welfare provisions were still tied to where they, or rather where their parents were born. And so that has meant, in effect, and this continues up right until today, that as you mentioned, they are in most cases not able to get access to the same higher quality medical care in the cities that those that have this official hukou in the cities can get. And nor are they in most cases able to put their children into the better urban schools. So this has all sorts of repercussions, as well as just being a human rights issue. It means that they have a tendency to save more and spend less, what economists call precautionary savings. They are very aware that because medical costs are higher for them, because education is often more expensive and lower quality, they tend to save more. And this has big implications for the overall economy. The actual conditions of them working in the factories saw a great improvement over the last 10, 20 years. When I first started writing and visiting factories in China in the mid 90s, there was still, there was still very much the old sweatshop factory that we think of when we think of very poor conditions for workers. That still very much was in existence. And at that time, even though the workers were allowed to come to the cities to work, they still had, as I said, they still had the hukou registration. In many cases, factory owners would require that the workers hand over their hukou permits, which is like a little book, like a little passport book, for the duration of when they worked in the factories. And this put them at great risk when they would leave the factories and travel around or just go out into the cities where they were working. They could be picked up by local police officials because they were supposed to be carrying their hukou at all times, even though as I said, the factory managers would take it away from them in many cases. And then the factory conditions themselves as well were quite bad. The dormitories were very crowded, more people sleeping in a dormitory, not very good food provided in the cafeterias. And so this was really the condition back then. There was a steady improvement over the years, in part because of pressure through the anti-sweatshop movement in the West, actually, where students and other people in Western countries started to demand that the big famous brands like Nike and so on would ensure that their supplier factories were treating their workers better. And this became a sort of a global movement and did actually impact on the conditions in China. And then actually simply through demography, in part because of the one-child policy, China started to have fewer workers per factory, and slowly the balance of power sort of shifted from management to worker. And so a worker would not be necessarily desperate for every job that was offered them in a factory because there were other opportunities, and the factories themselves had to compete to a larger degree to actually bring these workers in, and that meant improving conditions, whether it was in dorms or cafeterias.
The hukou policy is to the visitor in China is totally invisible, but it plays a very crucial role. I think first in rapid economic rise of China, but also in preventing slums. When you travel in China, especially in the large cities, you don't see the slums there. And one of the fascinating things you mentioned in the book is that how China managed to industrialize without urbanize. because sometimes industrialization and urbanization, or most of the times, go together. But in case of China, that has stopped beyond a certain point. Would you shed some more light on it?
Yeah, again, really through the fairly unique, today anyway, institution of the hukou in China, they have been able to have this tremendous industrial growth. And as you say, avoid having large slums on the sides of cities. That's simply because of the hukou, these migrant workers have really been put in a situation where, you know, they work in the factories in many cases sort of at the behest of the factory managers, and because they have this second class status and they're not officially supposed to be resident of the cities, they're also city officials, when they feel that perhaps a migrant community on the outskirts of the city is becoming too large, or they feel that they want to reduce the population, it's very, very easy and very legal for them. Using the local regulations, they can push these migrants out of the cities. If the factories don't need them anymore, the city officials, in many cases, don't want them there anymore. And they can do everything from, one common and rather unfortunate tactic, if you will, that is used is they will go into, typically there are these small private schools that will sprout up to serve the migrant worker kids when the migrant worker kids come with their parents to the cities. And that's because those migrant worker children cannot get into the public schools. They're often not very high quality, as I mentioned earlier. They often are actually not that cheap, that you have to pay for them. And so what the local officials can do is go in and do an inspection and say, they'll say something like, well, this local school, private school, doesn't have proper registration, or it's a fire trap, or there's some problem with it, and they'll simply shut it down. And that's a very effective way to push the migrants back out of the cities.
So despite all these challenges and hurdles, migrants do come there, work there, save some money, and send it back to their parents or families. And reverting back a little bit in the countryside, there is another policy that has been around there for a long time that is also affecting the rise or the changes in economic growth in China, and that is the dual land system. Tell us a little bit more about what is the dual land system and how especially the migrants are affected by it.
So the dual land system is also a legacy policy that dates back to the Mao era. And what is that policy? It basically creates this distinction between urban land and rural land. And what they did in the countryside is, officially the rural land in the countryside is owned by the collective, which was the old local political and social grouping in the countryside. And what that means in effect is that people in the rural countryside, and this includes migrant workers, who typically, when they go and work in a factory, will still have a small plot of land back in the countryside, which they can farm if they return. This land in the countryside is, so basically the rural people and migrants find it, because of this policy, very difficult to monetize this land. And that means in most cases they're unable to rent it or sell it at anything close to market rate. And this stands in dramatic contrast to what we've seen in the cities in China, which, although there is a lease, in most cases a 70-year lease on urban property that the government grants, some of those leases are coming up and the government is likely to just add another 70 years or add another period. So that has allowed urban people in China to actually rent and sell their property, their apartments in the cities. And it's actually probably the biggest reason behind this explosion of urban wealth in China. It's also, frankly, the biggest reason that China is facing such an alarming wealth gap today. And that's because people in the cities, because of the dual land system, are able to become very wealthy off the apartments that they might own. And this is not at all the case for the people in the countryside. I should add that land in the countryside can be marketized, but because of this distinction that says it belongs to the collective, that in effect means that only local officials have the power to basically rezone the land from agricultural to industrial or commercial, and then sell it on and make large amounts of money. And it's something that's become a very important source of income, actually, for local governments around China. this ability to rezone and sell on or lease on rural land. But again, back to my point, this is something that the rural people themselves, the migrants and the farmers, have by and large been unable to participate in.
So the years go by and the Chinese manufacturing engine continues to roar along and create more jobs, suck up more migrants and provide more jobs and improve the lives of many of the people. But in the end, migrants are still migrants in their own country, and they are second-class citizens, and they are struggling to settle down. And settling down for migrant is a very difficult decision point. I think you bring it up in many times during the book, that when migrants go back home for sometimes because they get tired or they get laid off or they are looking for a different kind of lifestyle, they have a very difficult time adjusting back for language reasons or many other reasons. Tell us how a migrant remains a migrant in China and why it is still so difficult.
So the argument I make in my book, and this is not something that is news at all to Chinese policymakers, they themselves have been saying for quite a few years now, at least 7 years, that they see the need to reform these the dual land policy and the hukou policy. And the argument I make in my book is that China cannot continue to grow in this way, cannot continue to bring more people into the middle class without actually doing away with these policies. And the leadership, particularly at a big party plenum in 2013, has made it very clear that they know that they need to move this direction. And why they need to move this direction, in part because of the demographic changes, in part because of the one-child policy before. The workforce, although very, very large, has actually started to shrink slightly in recent years, those people of working age, and it's become older. And this has meant often, much to the benefit of the workers in the factories, it's meant higher wages for them. And this has slowly made it more and more difficult for China to compete as factory to the world. And, today we have a situation where workers in China are not that cheap anymore. They're more expensive in China than they are in Malaysia. They're more expensive than they are in Mexico. So what does that mean for the Chinese government? Again, they know which direction to go. They see that this old factory to the world model will no longer work, and they want to move towards a economy that still has manufacturing but is much more automated, has a much larger service economy, and critically is one that is not so reliant on the rest of the world for exports. And frankly, the trade war with the U.S. and COVID-19 have made that even that imperative of moving away from their reliance on the rest of the world even more important. And they want to be much more reliant on the spending power of their own people. And again, the argument I make in my book is that in order to do that, they really need to start to reform these two policies, these legacy policies, much, much more quickly. There are some very substantial obstacles, which we can talk about if we'd like, which are behind the fact that they've made such limited progress so far until today.
Please continue to talk about, yes, what are the hurdles and what are the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, so as I said, we heard there was a party plenum in 2013, shortly after the Xi Jinping, the present leader and party secretary, took power, which announced with quite a bit of fanfare that they would move rapidly to reform and eventually dismantle the hukou policy and the dual land policy. And they were very clear that that was necessary in order to make this economic transition from factory of the world to one that is much more reliant on the spending power of their own people. So far, in the 7 years intervening, progress has been very slow and very piecemeal. So they've opened up certain cities, usually smaller cities around the country, to more hukou reform, to allow the rural people and the migrants to settle longer term there. But they've been very restrictive about exactly what cities will open up. Some of the big showcase cities, which historically have been very popular for migrants because of the job opportunities, have actually made it more difficult for the migrants, places like Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen, for example. So what are some of the reasons why they've moved slowly? Again, I'm not surprised. I think it's clear that's the direction that they need to go, and they know it already themselves, but it isn't easy. One big issue I mentioned earlier with the reform of the dual land policy, the fact that local governments, which happen to be also be in charge of paying social welfare needs like pensions and healthcare and education, they derive a lot of their incomes, maybe up to half of their incomes, from land sales themselves. So if the dual land system were reformed so that a lot more of the value of the land and the land market went to the migrants and the farmers, that would mean less for the local governments. And this is a big issue. And they've talked about different reforms to try to basically wean local governments off their reliance on land sales, everything from instituting a property tax, which they don't have nationally at all now, and other fiscal reforms as well to try to solve that dilemma of that local governments are so reliant on land sales. On the hukou policy, there are equally significant obstacles. One big one, as I mentioned earlier, the local governments are responsible for paying the social welfare costs. So if hukou reform proceeds as the leadership knows that it should, and people have much more freedom migrants have much more freedom to settle down in cities and get access to the same healthcare and education as the urban people, there's a big open question about how is that going to be paid for. And there's a perception amongst many officials in China that will be quite expensive to integrate these people into the cities. I should mention that there are other officials and scholars in China that believe that it won't be as expensive as people fear, that the migrants themselves are hardworking people. They come to the cities to work, they could pay taxes, and they would pay much of the cost of themselves of the new social welfare burdens. So that's another burden, however, that perception, real or not, that it will be exorbitant to bring them in. And then a real big one, sadly, is the fact that there's quite strong resistance from those urban people in China who do have the official hukou policy to live in the cities. And some of the protests we've seen in Chinese cities in recent years have actually been around education and have been by urban hukou holders who react very strongly against these well-meaning efforts by the government, the central government often, to allow more rural kids and migrant kids into the public school system. And you can understand the attitude. It's basically, in many cases, the people with the rural hukous struggle themselves to get their own children into the best schools in the cities. And now they're being asked to accept the fact that a lot more competition will come in with the children of migrant workers. And the same thing with the medical care in the cities. And there's been very strong resistance by the urban hukou holders themselves. So very real obstacles. But as I said earlier, I do think that despite these obstacles, it's become increasingly apparent that these policies do need to be reformed if China can actually make real progress on this very important economic transition that they're aiming for.
The irony of the situation is that China has gone into two policies simultaneously. One is rapid automation or adoption of robots, as you bring it up in the book. So that way more, or at least the manufacturing, could be preserved and standards of production are kept. At the same time, fewer and fewer workers are needed and also available, so they can tackle that. Second, the wages are rising. At the same time, Chinese policymakers are promoting to do more service expansion or service industry expansion, but the people are not able to adjust to that as rapidly or in the way they should be adjusting according to the wishes of policymakers. Tell us how that whole thing is going on. The rise of logistics and the jobs that come with it, and the gig economy and the rising wages, and still the migrants remaining migrants, how that all collides in the urban scenarios or urban landscape of China.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And if you look at what's happened in China in recent years, you can see that the transition to in particular, a more service-driven economy is really happening. If you look both at the proportion of the service industry in the overall GDP of China, it has grown. And manufacturing and construction has become smaller. Agriculture has become much smaller. And if you look at the proportion of people, and particularly migrants, that are where they work, you'll see as well that actually more of them work today in service industry jobs than either on construction sites or in manufacturing facilities, in factories, which is where the bulk of them for many years were always employed. So that transition is happening, and that's something that the Chinese government wants to see, this move towards a more service-driven economy and also on the employment side. The challenge lies in what kind of service industry is rising up and what kind of jobs are being provided for these people. And the government quite naturally would like to see a higher value-added service industry. They would like to see the kind of jobs created being ones that pay relatively well, certainly pay better than the factory jobs or the construction jobs, and are so basically contribute more towards this higher value service added or higher value added service economy that the government very much wants to see. Now, so far the progress has been very limited, and illustrative of that point, if you look at what now is probably the most important service industry job for workers in China, along with working in restaurants, which has always been important and quite low end, washing dishes or cleaning restaurants or cooking, that still exists. The other very important job is in the logistics sector, as you mentioned, and this is motorcycle delivery people. And it's very, very important. It's become even more important, I believe, in the last few months with COVID-19. And it's where so many of the migrants now are finding jobs as jobs dry up in the factories. The problem is it pays all right. It doesn't pay that well. It doesn't pay as well as the government would like to see. And frankly, it's a pretty miserable business. And quite dangerous. There's all kinds of traffic accidents that happen now that these migrants are involved in as they feel increasing pressure to dart around the cities on their motorcycles and make quick deliveries to the urban residents. So we're seeing this transition happening, but not quite in the way that the government in Beijing would like it to see.
So what reality has happened is that the migrant workers are moving into the service sector as the government would like them to go, but they're not going into the higher value-added services like programming or e-commerce driven, but they are taking more and more low-skilled jobs, which doesn't really help the economic growth at all. And that leads to my next point. And in order for them to move on a higher value-added curve, you need good quality education. And for these people and their children, that good quality education is a pie in the sky. Even though China is known to produce lots and lots of scientists and engineers in the urban area and excelled enormously well, but when it comes to the rural China, the situation is very different. Tell us more about that, how dire the situation is there in the dropout rate, in the quality of education, and the separation of the families that many of these children are growing up in the boarding schools.
Yeah, I think this is a key point, and it gets to China's ability to meet its goals of becoming also a more innovative economy, which frankly I think is going to be extremely difficult unless they can redress this urban-rural education imbalance. And so what's happening there? I mean, one thing to note, which is a real tragedy, is that in many cases, because of these restrictions on migrant children going to schools in the cities, in many cases, they simply stay back, separated from their parents in the countryside. And there's an expression in China, left behind children. And this is these left behind children who grow up far from their parents, typically see them perhaps once a year when the parents were able to come home usually for the Lunar New Year, which is the biggest holiday of the year, have previously often grew up with their grandparents who had very low education themselves, weren't particularly skilled in child rearing, and more in recent years are instead growing up in these impersonal boarding schools, which is an example of a well-meaning effort by the government to try to improve rural education, improve the rural education. And what they did is they shut down many of the small village schools that weren't particularly high quality at all that the rural children were going to, and instead created these large boarding schools, put a lot of money into building them. Sometimes the facilities are quite impressive, but unfortunately tend to be large impersonal places. The kids grow up, living in dormitory rooms, not not dissimilar from what their parents have experienced, at least in previous years, in the factories in the cities. And there's all kinds of problems that arise, psychological problems, physical problems, because of there's malnutrition is a big issue amongst rural kids in these in these boarding schools as well. So there's all these problems that arise. One of the most dramatic statistics that you can look at is the dropout rates for rural versus urban kids in China. And I don't have the exact numbers right now, but it's far more frequent in the countryside, in part because these schools are so impersonal and unpleasant. And there's different. The Chinese government has their own statistics on graduation rates for high school kids, but those have been challenged by some very respected scholars outside China and inside China that have really focused on rural education. And there's a gentleman, Scott Rizal at Stanford University. He has a center called the Rural Education Action Program, and he's worked with different universities in China. And they've done some of the very best research on rural education in China. And what they found is very, very high and alarming dropout rates for these rural kids. I believe the figure that we discussed a couple of years ago, Scott Rizal and myself, was that if you look at the entire workforce in China now, something like a quarter of workers have actually not completed high school education. And this is mainly those rural kids, due to these rural kids that have dropped out. Again, this is a huge challenge for China going forward. They, made some very laudable efforts to put more money into rural education, but there's huge obstacles to real improvement. And one of them, as I mentioned earlier, is this system where the social welfare needs of the population are provided by the local governments rather than centrally. And that means that depending on the standard of living, you'll find great diversity or great gaps between the amount of education spent on children in a place like Shanghai, which has some of the best educated kids in the whole country, and a rural kid, a migrant kid, living in Guizhou province, which is one of the poorest provinces in China and one that I focus on in my book.
Very well said. So this is one of the myths that you're talking about. If China wants to migrate from the factory floor to the service economy to the high-tech and innovation-driven economy, China will have to do something about its education, equal access, and also improve the quality of education, not just in the cities, but also across the larger regions of the country, because that's what is going to give it the push that it needs to get to the next level. And so far, China has not succeeded in that, and that is one of the myths that people have ignored it or not looked at closely. And then it takes us to another myth, and that goes to the consumption. In order to have the consumption increased, you need rising income, and rising income can only happen if you are engaged in the higher value-added economy. Now, you had a fascinating thing in the book that many of these migrants, when they go back, they fear that if they become entrepreneurs and start businesses, they have this big worry that they may become poorer than they were before because they don't have the skills or the guangxi or the connections that they might need to be a successful business people. Tell us, what are the challenges that they're facing when they go back, and if they ever decide to start business, and what happens?
Yeah, you bring up a very important element of the trends happening now in the economy, and particularly with migrant workers, and that is that many of those migrants that no longer have jobs in factories or on construction sites are actually going back to the countryside, to the villages where they came from. So a significant portion are going into these, unfortunately, often lower value service jobs in the cities, but also a very large number are going back to the countryside. And that's something, by the way, that's something that the central government in China would like to see more of. They hope that they would go back and bring back skills that they learned in the cities and start small companies, as you mentioned, and play a part in rejuvenating these poorer parts of China, which are still very much lag the coastal areas. But what we're seeing is it's not very easy at all. There are efforts to try to help them become entrepreneurs in their villages. A big tool that they're supposed to use is e-commerce. So that's intended to, the idea is that will allow them to overcome the distances and basically advertise their wares, whether it's locally grown organic vegetables or a bed and breakfast in a beautiful part of China that they're trying to lure urban people to come to, that they can use the internet in order to get out the word and drive that business. The reality is it hasn't been very easy at all. And as you brought up earlier, there is a great fear and a great reality that in many cases, these migrants who have spent most of their lives away from their villages are not very well equipped to go back and become local entrepreneurs. There are many stories of them going back, starting small businesses, not having the connections or the guanxi, as you say, in the villages, feeling somewhat alienated, having spent most of their lives away from these areas and in much larger cities and urban areas in China, and these businesses not succeeding. So while I think that this is a wonderful idea, and in some cases, I hope it will be very successful, it's really not that easy for these people to go back and recreate themselves after being factory workers or construction site workers as small entrepreneurs.
So as we take one myth after the other, and I'm summarizing that China's middle class will keep expanding forever, and that is a myth because it has its own limits. China's education-driven, innovation-driven economy will happen very soon as it migrates from a manufacturing to the service economy, has its own limits, and it may take much longer than we all anticipate or we would like to have. And China's ability to create large number of scientists and engineers in the urban areas may not translate that well in the inner China, and that also is a myth. May translate into China, but that may not happen as fast, and that's also another myth. And that is something that China will overcome eventually, hopefully, but it may take longer than we all think. And then it leads to a myth that actually was originated here in Washington that traveled very well in Beijing as well, and I don't think Beijing ever believed in it, that economic reform, spurred in many ways during the accession or joining of the World Trade Organization, would also lead eventually to political reforms. Unfortunately, that has not happened and is not likely to happen in near time soon at all. Tell us more about that. Actually, more economic progress leads to even less and fewer political reform, because that's the way people want. That's the way middle class wants it.
Yeah, I think you're right that this was very much the belief, or at least the hope of large numbers of people and policymakers in places like Washington, that economic reform and particularly entry to the World Trade Organization would lead inevitably to more demands, a stronger civil society, and more demands for political reforms by the people in China. And that really has not happened. And there's actually quite interesting research that shows that people in the cities, not surprisingly, as they become more educated, maybe perhaps initially this seems surprising, but if you think about it, as they become more educated, as they become wealthier, they have a much larger stake in the system as it works. And that has translated into less of a willingness to speak out for political or civil rights changes. And by contrast, there's more pressure coming from those people that have been left out of the Chinese economic miracle, those people that have less to lose, typically are less well educated and have not joined the middle class. So that's an interesting fact, which research shows that that's actually the case in China. I argue in my book that there's been this implicit bargain between the Communist Party of China, which is the government of China, and the people, and that this has worked quite well with the people in the cities. And that is, as long as we guarantee continually growing living standards for you and your families, then you will you do your part of the bargain and not demand real political change, and not hold our leaders accountable for giving you more civil rights. And we've seen that succeed beyond perhaps even beyond the Communist Party's leaders' vision in China. There has been little pushback by urbanites against the system as it is. And so I think you're right. And that's an point I make in my book. I think that is another myth about China and the Chinese economy, that all of us in the rest of the world, if we care about these things and we care about civil society and political reform, need to begin to face up to. And I think people are doing so now.
And that leads us to a last myth, and also a very important juncture in our discussion about the book, and that is China versus Japan. The rapid rise of Japan and then dramatic stagnation for more than 2 years of Japan. Similarly, China rose rapidly for 4 decades, and in the majority of that, or in some ways, many of that drivers were Taiwan and Japanese companies who were relocating their operations there in China. But now China has a demographic challenges, has a gigantic debt load, and at the same time is trapped in the middle income. Trying to break the middle income trap requires higher level of education, requires more mobility, requires more freedom. That may or may not happen in China, but at least the policymakers in Beijing believe that they can escape or break the middle income trap with the current set of policies, with a little bit of more automation and rapid automation that they believe Japan did not do. Is China heading to a more stagnation or likely to have very, very slow economic growth? And many of the people believe it's not possible, that China will keep rising, China will keep growing, and so on. But you make a very convincing argument that that may not be the case. China may suffer, like Japan, its own stagnation in the years to come.
I think it's very likely that China's growth will slow, and perhaps slow dramatically. And it's not really surprising if you look at what's driven growth up until today. And we saw tremendous growth in productivity and overall economic growth in previous years with some of these key reforms, and I mentioned them earlier, bringing in foreign investment and capital with Deng's reforms, and then with the entry to the World Trade Organization, the move away from the agricultural economy got smaller and smaller as these migrants left farms and moved into factories and on construction sites. They became far more productive. The agricultural economy in China, whole nother story there, is tremendously unproductive today. And so there was a burst of productivity or a wave of productivity that was released by allowing this migration of people into the cities. As China continued to allow a larger role for private enterprises and began to reform state enterprises, which used to dominate most of the economy, and started those reforms in the late 90s and early 2000s, productivity was unleashed as well. And this drove all this very impressive growth that we've seen until today. And it also drove much higher living standards. Very impressive. So the argument I make in my book is that, unfortunately, many of these reforms have stalled. And new reforms that are crucial to unleashing new waves of productivity don't seem to be happening. I would argue that if China were to actually live up to these promises they've been making to more rapidly and eventually do away with that hukou policy and do away with the dual land policy, they would be able to unleash a new wave of productivity, which would allow China to avoid this future of potential stagnation, economic stagnation. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not terribly optimistic simply because I don't see China moving in that direction, and those certainly not in the last 5 or so years. And I haven't seen anything that suggests that they are about to reverse course and actually put economic reforms sort of put a high priority on them as they did in earlier years.
You bring up a couple of very high-profile incidences in the book. One is about the Foxconn, the other is about the media buying hukou, robotics maker in Germany, and also Geely buying the stake surreptitiously in the Daimler-Benz. These are all the attempts, at least by the private sector, in acquiring new sources of competitiveness. Have these things worked out for them? Because so far there is no sign that these things have worked out, even though several billions of dollars have been spent in it, in acquiring these technologies. Because China is the largest market of the robotics and so on, but majority of the robots that are made by 800 so company are just basically assembling the products, parts that are made by the Americans or Japanese or the Germans. They are just assemblers. They're not really makers of robotics.
Yeah, I think they still have room to go before you can declare any of those major acquisitions as real successes. And I wouldn't say that on the other hand, I wouldn't say that we certainly can't call them failures. They very well may start to meet these goals, whether it's robot production or others in the years going forward. But I do think, that there are these very large challenges, some of which we've already talked about. In order for these big acquisitions to succeed, I would argue they need a government that is less focused on sort of top-down control of the economy and gives more play to the private entrepreneurs who run some of these companies to make their own decisions on business and commercial decisions. And what we've seen by the contrary is a larger and larger state role over the economy. We've seen this very much through Party Secretary Xi Jinping, where even when he talks about the need to allow private entrepreneurs freedom to make their own business decisions and grow their companies, at the same time, he's also made it very clear that, as he put it himself, that along with making a profit, they need to love the party. And so we're seeing these increasing demands put on the private sector, particularly in times of stress. So when the economy starts to do worse, they are supposed to play an important role in sort of helping the government meet its longer-term economic and political goals. And I think that's a real restraint on their ability to fully realize these acquisitions and become a very effective private companies. A big one we discussed earlier. I think that as long as they have this deeply unequal education system, they're going to struggle to create a vibrant, innovative private economy, because I would argue that you need a well-educated workforce, not just half the workforce or a quarter of the workforce, but a well-educated bulk of the workforce in order to have a more innovative and vibrant private sector.
And that leads to another myth that we just discussed, but we didn't label it that way, and that was that the private sector is the source of all the new wealth and source of all the new job creation. Then the private sector should be allowed to flourish, but unfortunately right now is the state sector that has again started dominating, and that is another myth that people have to overcome, or China has to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, although the private sector is very important, and if you look at employment, they are the number one employer of workers in China, much more so than the state sector. But one of the very crucial challenges is creating a financing system that is a little more fair when it comes to giving out credit to the private sector versus the public sector or the state sector, and that gets to the fact that China's banking system is by and large all state-owned, and it's not surprising that if your banking sector is all state-owned, that they're going to be often more inclined to lend to state enterprises. If for no other reason that they feel they understand them better, and perhaps they think they're more likely to get their money paid back than they will be to the private sector. And so that's a whole other area of reform that I think is very crucial for China if it does want to make this economic transition, and that is the financial sector.
We've been talking to Dexter Roberts, the author of The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. So much about the topic. Tell us a little bit about the book. How did you end up writing the book? How long it took, and why this book?
Well, yeah, the origins of the book go way back. I came to China in the beginning of 1995, and as a reporter then for Business Week magazine, which is where I stayed for many, many years. And one of the big stories in the early days was trying to help China had a big policy called Develop the West. And the goal was, this was under the previous party secretary and president, Jiang Zemin, was to try to start to lift living standards and lift economies in the interior of China, which were already then very badly lagging the coastal areas following Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And so I think it was the year 2000, I went out to Guizhou, the province I focus on, the far southwestern province, which is quite poor even today, that I focus on in my book. And I was working actually on two big stories. They were cover stories for Business Week. One was on this Develop the West program. I think the actual title language of the cover I did was called The Great Wealth Gap. And then a little bit later in the year, I came back again and did a story called The Great Migration, which was on the migrant workers, which then were coming in increasing numbers to the cities to work, and would come in even larger numbers a year plus later after China entered the WTO in late 2001. And at the time, I had spent most of my first 5 years in China, I would say, in the bigger cities. And it was a real eye-opener for me to go and spend this significant time in really very deeply rural parts of China, there in Guizhou province. And not only did I find I had a great affinity for that part of China and found it extremely fascinating and wonderfully interesting and wonderfully kind people out there, but at the same time, I started to realize that these very big issues that I was writing about, the wealth gap in China, the regional wealth gap in China, and this enormous migration of people, were a really vital part of China's economy, and that China really needed to figure out how to manage these huge trends that we were seeing, a wealth gap and this internal migration, if it was going to eventually succeed in building a much larger economy and building a sustainable economy. So at the time, I had a very wise editor at the time who said, these are fascinating cover stories you've just done. These are the sorts of things that are worthy potentially of a book. And so at the time, I actually thought I would like to come back and focus on these topics in a book form at some much later date. If you fast forward a bunch of years, I started to do stories on some of the legacy policies, including the hukou policy, including the one-child policy, and the dual land policy. This was many years later, looking at how those policies still were very much alive in China and how they were obstacles to continued economic development. And it was at that point that I really decided I wanted to go ahead and pursue this book. And not too long after that, went through and as you do, found a book publisher and so on, and started to actually work on the book.
I think we're all glad that you did write the book because it's been fascinating. Any other books in the works, or are you more associated with the China now, or with Asia, or focus more on certain topics?
So I don't have a book to announce now, but I certainly hope that in the future I will. It's something this is my first book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. I loved writing it. I loved researching it. And I certainly hope to have more books in my future. And I'll let you know, Manish, when I start to actively pursue those. Now I'm still very much focused on China, both through the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana here, and also through this role as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a department there called the Asia, or a program there rather, called the Asia Security Initiative. So still very focused on China, but also on Asia more largely.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.